I'm fighting like hell, and we're going to protect Canada. He's underestimating the Canadian people. I don't start a tariff war, but we're going to win this tariff war. 1.5 million American homes and businesses that Ontario powers, if the United States escalates, will not hesitate to shut the electricity off completely.
Ontario has just made a bold move, cutting the United States out of a $20 billion deal by bringing Volkswagen's massive battery factory to St. Thomas. But this isn't just another economic win. It's a statement. Ontario is charting its own economic future, turning away from US dependency and forging new paths with Europe. The Gigafactory in St. Thomas will produce enough batteries to power 1 million European electric vehicles every year. None of those cars will be headed to the US. Instead, Ontario is leveraging its resources, skilled workforce, and strategic location to serve European partners who value what's being offered. This raises a big question. Can the US afford to lose access to Ontario's critical minerals and clean energy? And can a single Canadian province really push back against the world's largest economy and succeed? If Ontario's gamble works, other provinces may quickly follow suit. This shift has been building for years. In Windsor, a retired utility worker watched in disbelief as President Donald Trump doubled tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum. Infrastructure that once represented shared progress was suddenly a pawn in a growing trade war. Industry leaders across Ontario quickly began rethinking their priorities. At the steel plant in Sault Ste. Marie, European buyers started calling. Hamilton steel mills explored shipping through Atlantic ports. The tariff wasn't just a tax, it was a turning point. The automotive industry felt the shock immediately. Just-in-time supply chains broke down. Parts from Ontario failed to reach US factories. Assembly lines in Kentucky, Texas, and Michigan halted, costing an estimated $10 million per hour. Back in St. Thomas, Volkswagen executive Sebastian Wolf stood on a site that had been chosen for logistical efficiency. But as the trade war escalated, the Gigafactory became more than just a business project. It became a symbol of economic independence. Ontario was no longer looking to Detroit. It was looking toward Dusseldorf. Ontario's wealth of raw materials, clean energy supply, and new trade direction made it a natural fit for European partnerships. What started as retaliation had become redirection. The St. Thomas Gigafactory, spanning 370 acres, was designed to support 1 million electric vehicles annually. It would directly employ 3,000 workers, with tens of thousands more connected through supply chains. Solid-state battery technology, with its longer range and lower costs, addressed key hurdles in EV adoption. Local officials saw the project as a rebirth for the region, powered by innovation. Colleges and training centers collaborated to retrain auto workers, including people like Maria Santos, once on a conventional assembly line, now preparing for a career in clean energy. Ontario's advantages extend beyond provincial borders. Its reserves of lithium, nickel, and cobalt position it as a global hub for critical resources. Agreements with the EU have fast-tracked permitting and guaranteed long-term access. When Ontario began redirecting rare earth shipments to Europe during the power standoff, the message was clear. The province was no longer beholden to Washington's agenda. New agreements were structured specifically to bypass US intermediaries. Power for the Gigafactory comes from Ontario's nuclear and hydroelectric grid, known for its reliability and transparency. In today's geopolitics, neutrality and dependability often matter more than proximity. But the energy grid couldn't escape the fallout. In Toronto, grid operator Leila Fakhri received an extraordinary directive. Simulate what would happen if Ontario stopped exporting electricity to the US. Her findings were sobering. Ontario's grid would become unstable. Surpluses would go to waste. Stations would overload. On the US side, blackouts would hit upstate New York, rural Michigan, and much of Minnesota within days. Though no blackouts occurred, the shock was psychological. In 2023, Ontario exported 49.4 terawatt-hours of electricity to the US, powering homes and industries across several states. Now, every one of those agreements was under review. The infrastructure that took a century to build now symbolized broken trust. The short-lived surcharge on power exports revealed a deeper truth. Essential services could be weaponized. The stability that held the system together had fractured. Rebuilding would require more than policy. It would require restraint, transparency, and a shared commitment to cooperation. Meanwhile, a dramatic shift unfolded. Prime Minister Mark Carney chose Paris, not Washington, for his first official foreign visit. At the Élysée Palace, standing beside French President Emmanuel Macron, Carney announced a sweeping review of all strategic partnerships involving the United States. For the first time in history, Canada was publicly rethinking its integration with the US. In Brussels, Foreign Affairs Minister Mélanie Joly entered closed-door talks to explore joining the EU's $1.25 trillion Rearm Europe initiative. "We've become too dependent on American defense systems," she said. "It threatens our sovereignty." The European defense shift wasn't just about military hardware. It was a reimagining of Canada's role in the world. Since 1949, Canadian defense had mirrored American standards. Now Canada was building its own path, often with Europe. Trade between Canada and the EU has grown 66% since 2017. Quebec saw an opportunity. Culturally linked to Europe, it was ready to lead. Defense firms like Rheinmetall and General Dynamics were adjusting operations for European buyers. The realignment wasn't speculative, it had already begun. In Ottawa, Defense Minister Bill Blair was rethinking the $19 billion contract for 88 F-35 jets. The issue wasn't just cost, it was control. American contracts came with restrictions and political strings. In contrast, European firms offered local production and full tech transfers. European partners prioritized reliability over dominance. Canadian manufacturers, once tied to US defense contracts, were shifting toward European orders with fewer conditions and longer commitments. Research collaborations, capital investments, and talent development followed. In the Arctic, Canadian-led systems were being developed with Norway and Denmark. Indigenous defense capacity, once sidelined, was now central. On the economic front, Ontario was becoming a strategic hinge between European technology and global energy markets. Battery production wasn't just about cars. It was about who would control the next industrial era. Research hubs in Quebec and Ontario were collaborating with European firms. The IP stayed local. The supply chains bypassed US policies. Near Kingston, a $1.5 billion cathode plant connected Ontario mines to Europe's gigafactories. In Quebec, vertical farms powered by Canadian hydro and Dutch batteries began transforming agriculture. Halifax Port expanded to handle battery exports to Europe. The Trans Mountain Pipeline allowed energy to reach Asia without passing through the US-European investment surged. Norway funded hydrogen projects. Germany backed renewable plants. Dutch banks financed agricultural tech. This wasn't a coincidence, it was coordinated sovereignty. Canadian businesses gained access to stable capital and markets. In return, Europe secured critical resources and manufacturing strength. A new infrastructure map emerged, one that deliberately avoided American choke points. The Battery Corridor from Ontario to Hamburg became the blueprint for a post-American economic alignment. But even as Ontario gained autonomy, it confronted a hard reality. Power grids can't be politicized. Nuclear and hydroelectric systems operate by physics, not policy. When exports stop, power surges or goes to waste. The infrastructure had evolved over 70 years to work across borders. Disruptions risked collapse on both sides. Hospitals in Minnesota prepared for outages they never imagined. Ontario's own grid faced destabilization within days if exports halted. The conclusion was unavoidable. Cross-border integration wasn't optional. It was structural. Energy independence, while appealing, clashed with engineering reality. Then came the American response. U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick called Ottawa with a warning: cancel Ontario's surcharge or face broader retaliation. Doug Ford had to decide. The US was no longer using just tariffs, it was floating deeper threats. Canada's energy leverage had been noticed. U.S. refineries depend on Canadian crude, over 3 million barrels per day. Replacing it would cost billions. But now, with Trans Mountain finished, Canada had alternatives. Asian buyers were lining up, and Alberta's oil wasn't just for fuel. It was critical to everything from plastics to fertilizer. States began to panic. Michigan sought relief. New York imposed emergency quotas. America saw for the first time that Canada had real leverage and fewer reasons to comply. The climate toll added insult to injury. Ontario's clean power had helped U.S. states like Massachusetts meet emissions goals. Now without it, emissions jumped. Coal plants restarted. Diesel generators fired up. Climate targets were shelved. A trade war meant losing years of environmental progress. Back in Ontario, the realignment continued quietly. A factory in Windsor once supplying Detroit was now shipping EV chargers to Europe. Dutch and German investors retrained workers. Modular plants popped up under the Advanced Manufacturing Corridor Initiative. Korean engineers trained battery teams. Norwegian funds backed hydrogen plants. Indigenous communities in northern Ontario developed microgrids feeding surplus power into the provincial system, providing both jobs and energy security. This transformation wasn't loud. It happened contract by contract, with companies choosing European markets over unstable US agreements. Ontario colleges rewrote curriculums to match global standards. Developers optimized software for Brussels, not Washington. Ontario had quietly become a bridge, connecting Europe's innovation with global supply chains. Its economy had evolved into something new, flexible, independent, and increasingly post-American. At the heart of this shift were two things: trust and stability. American deals now came with risk. European partnerships came with predictability. And across every sector, from energy to defense to agriculture, Canada was no longer waiting on Washington. It was moving forward on its own terms. So where does this leave the United States? Can it regain trust in a relationship that's already moved on? Or will it keep losing ground to alliances that offer more than threats? We're watching a quiet, powerful realignment. The question is whether it's the end of an era or the beginning of something much bigger. Please like, subscribe, and share Torchpoint for more information content. Thanks for watching.